Inner city Melbourne, a cosmopolitan, livable and trendy area with property prices consistently exceeding the millions. Merely 60 to 70 years ago, however, the inner suburbs of Melbourne differed significantly from their present state. It harboured severe disadvantage and poverty and was beset by a series of slums. The level of squalor and unsanitary living conditions was so extreme that the Victorian government initiated the largest slum clearance program in Australia. In this documentary, we examine the effectiveness of the government's slum clearance program as a response to the slum problem in inner Melbourne. Our objective is to gain insights into the motivations behind the decision to initiate this program, trace the development of slum abolitionism, and explore the social repercussions stemming from the Housing Commission's demolition and construction works. Through our investigation, we discovered that while the slum reclamation policy was well-intentioned, it ultimately led to an unnecessary destruction of communities. This is because the condition of housing in inner Melbourne improved naturally due to the efforts of young professionals and European migrants who purchased and revitalised inexpensive, dilapidated homes during the 1960s and 70s. We also understand that public housing built in the place of slum pockets has been an inadequate form of low-cost housing for low-income families. This underscores the ongoing challenge for the Victorian government of providing social housing for our state's most vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. The term slum is a problematic one. It carries a stigmatising connotation and negative policy implications that include eviction, demolition, and displacement. Some might contend they are imagined spaces and labels made by the affluent to deprecate the poor. In inner Melbourne, slums were very real and they were characterised by overcrowding, inadequate infrastructure, lack of sanitation, poverty and poor living conditions. Towards the culmination of the slum reclamation program, the Housing Commission's definition of a slum was disputed as the inner city had undergone substantial renewal. However, at the inception of the Housing Commission's slum reclamation program, these were areas that unquestionably warranted significant improvement. Slums first emerged in Melbourne following the discovery of gold in the 1850s. The influx of migrants created an immediate need for housing that resulted in the construction of poorly built dwellings with cheap material in the inner suburbs.
There was a new society with a huge number of immigrants who had very little money, and they crowded round, when they first arrived, around what was known as the Collingwood Flat, and where they could often build a very cheap little house get a little bit of land. So that's the beginning of people building their own place, which most of them had never been able to do back in Britain or in Europe. So one of the great attractions of settler colonialism was the lure of being able to own land for the first time in your family's history ever. So they were able to get little blocks, and none of those houses fell down and were very poor and tiny.
Slum areas were overcrowded and congested as property allotments could be repeatedly subdivided by speculators.
The pattern of Fitzroy was largely due to uncontrolled and rampant capitalism and subdivision on subdivision on subdivision. And so all of these tiny houses and shacks were constructed in the little back streets of Fitzroy, and they were built without much regard to building regulations.
By the 1880s, demographic shifts caused a concentration of poverty in the inner city.
What happened in Melbourne with the development of public transport and so on was that the aspirational middle class and people who were, ambitious, moved out to the suburbs and also, of course, industry moved into the inner suburbs, and industry became much larger, employing more people at that time. So you got really a sort of industrial working class in the inner suburbs, and people with more aspirations and background moving to the middle class suburbs.
They were very, very poor people. They were people who traditionally had worked in manufacturing. Over here in North Melbourne, they would have worked at the abattoirs, which were just up the road there, or they might have worked in the docks. but they were really poor people, and their living conditions were just appalling.
The inner city slum areas had a raft of problems that people living there had to experience. The overcrowded conditions and ramshackle dwellings were often without washing facilities and bathrooms. They were dirty, unsanitary, and harboured vermin and disease. The slums were hotbeds for criminality, prostitution, and drunkenness.
There was a lot of depravity, there was enormous social problems, despair, poverty, alcoholism, violence were characteristics of these slums.
At the time, local government was the only political authority that could mitigate some of the problems of the slums, by declaring homes unfit for habitation or by demolishing houses. But under-resourced and underpowered, they faced an uphill battle. The poor conditions of houses were also neglected by absentee landlords and a lack of rental standards.
So you've got a cash-poor landlord class. They've paid the house off by then, but they're cash poor. They couldn't renovate them, they couldn't maintain services, and a lot of the houses were built before there were building regulations that mandated things like damp courses. So they're built without damp courses, they're often built almost directly on the ground, and so they deteriorated very quickly. So the slums are there because housing is too expensive for ordinary people and workers, and there's a supply of substandard housing that's deteriorated rapidly, that they're not that old, but they've gone to pieces quite quickly. So by the 1930s there was a visible crisis.
A housing crisis in the rundown areas of the inner city was caused by the poverty and unemployment induced by the Great Depression. As the slums tarnished the prosperous image of marvellous Melbourne, there was a recognition by government that something had to be done. Although a royal commission was conducted into the conditions of the slums between 1915 and 1918, the Victorian government was made to act due to the campaign led by accountant and social reformer F. Oswald Barnett.
He was a very devout Methodist, a very active Methodist, so he was a brilliant publicist and he was a filmmaker, and he began to make films of the flat and taking photographs and giving slideshows at talks, and he developed a group around himself called the Good Companions, who were a Christian socialist group of young people who he activated. So he started campaigning, and he knew about publicity, and he persuaded the Herald and Weekly Times, as it was then, to back his campaign, and they published all these photographs. And the message that Oswald Barnett gave, which resonated strongly with respectable Methodists and other Protestants, especially in the eastern suburbs, was that slum housing was a reservoir of sin, and used this anxiety about private behaviour as a way of motivating middle-class Methodists and other Protestants particularly to be concerned about putting themselves behind a reform of housing.
Barnett also wrote heavily about the devastating conditions that young children of the slums were raised in.
Oh God, what shall I do about these little ones, these children of the slums, these helpless, unwashed babies of the slums who crawl along on bare and filthy floors, who feed with sticky flies, who play in evil, smelling lanes, whose mothers cannot keep them clean, in body or in soul?
So Barnett is very important, and he's important because he campaigns. He sees the need for a kind of politics, and he used to talk about his campaign in the inner suburbs, where he persuaded the Premier to lead a delegation to come and look at the slums, and that was the beginning really of developing higher standard housing for low-income people. So Barnett was an incredibly important person, along with Canterbury Tucker at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, in really running kind of political campaigns.
With significant mainstream print media attention from the Melbourne Herald, Barnett and Kennedy Tucker successfully lobbied the Dunstan Country Party government to tour the slums. Following this, Dunstan established the Housing Investigation and Slum Abolition Board in July 1936, which Barnett himself deputy chairs. In 1936 and 37, the board conducted a survey of over 7,000 homes within an 8-kilometre distance of the city. A report produced by the board found the vast majority of homes surveyed were incapable of being fit for habitation or required extensive repairs, and recommended a program of slum clearance. In response, the Dunstan government declared a war on slums. The 1937 Housing Act established the Housing Commission of Victoria, and the 1938 Slum Reclamation Act and the 1938 Reclamation and Housing Financial Act provided the framework for the Commission's work. The Housing Commission had its own statutory planning authority, and its mandate was to bulldoze and build.
Their brief was to acquire property, and they did that over a period of time, and then they used the compulsory acquisition instrument to effectively get all of the buildings in, say, the Atherton Gardens area in one fell swoop.
This state, I think, would it be fair to say, undertook the most significant slum reclamation program of any state in the Commonwealth. If you think about areas like Richmond, South Melbourne, Carlton, here, North Melbourne, Flemington, just across the way there. I mean, these are massive sweeps of land that were raised for the construction of these towers.
The Commission's work started slowly and on a small scale, building 2- and 3-storey villa estates due to labour and building materials shortages caused by the Second World War. Large-scale slum reclamation began in earnest during the early 1960s, when the Housing Commission leased the former Commonwealth Tank Factory in Holmes Glen to mass-produce the prefabricated concrete panel used to build the high-rise flats.
And like a lot of progressives, they were very much in love with what the Soviet Union was doing. They all went to Russia to see how they were building tower blocks. And they set up the big factory in Holmes Glen, the government factory, built them prefabricated concrete housing and tower blocks. So the tower blocks are actually very well engineered.
It was really quite innovative. It was manufactured housing rather than the old, you get the builder and the builder on site. So it was a radical change in that sense. This was the first time in Australia that we'd seen manufactured housing on scale.
And so, as the Commission began mass-producing the material to build the towers, it also went on with a job of acquiring and demolishing homes. Residents in the inner city were served with compulsory acquisition notices, paid compensation money, and relocated in what was a devastating form of social dislocation for many people.
So it's a thing driven by engineers who've got an engineering solution, and the plans eventually were to clear virtually the whole of Carlton right up to Victoria Street.
This bulldozer?
Yeah. And put in tower blocks, because that was being modern. That's a modern engineering solution.
By 1970, approximately 4,000 old houses across inner-city Melbourne were cleared to make way for 7,000 new units across 44 towers in 28 estates across 19 inner-city suburbs, which continued to punctuate the skyline of Melbourne today. The new homes built were administered by the Housing Commission as a form of public housing for low-income people, where rent was charged at a quarter of their salary. While the Housing Commission had good intentions in its slum clearance and urban renewal program, it failed to see beyond the poverty of people's surroundings and recognise the intimate connection residents had with their community before it was demolished.
The social problems, of course, were the dislocation of people. I mean, that's a pretty serious thing when you're saying to someone, sorry, you're out of here now. You may have lived, admittedly, in really poor conditions for a long time, and you just were dislocated. That's pretty confronting, I would have thought, for people more generally.
Additionally, a process of revitalisation of inner city housing, independent of government, happened during the 1960s and 70s, when young professionals and migrants began buying rundown homes at an affordable price and renovating them.
The young trendies, as they were known, were moving in and showing that these old houses could be recovered, could be restored, could be rebuilt. And so that it wasn't a lost asset.
In the end, the great wave of immigration, in a way, overcame the slum abolition policies of the government provided another solution to them by private enterprise picking up these dilapidated buildings and fixing them up.
As a result of changes in the inner suburbs, including increases in home ownership, a growing young and politically conscious population and house-proud migrants, opposition grew towards the Housing Commission's continued slum clearance and high-rise development through the protestations of highly motivated and organised residents' associations.
The public became increasingly concerned with the nature of the replacement buildings, and particularly the high-rise towers. And what really spawned, I think, the movement contesting the work of the Ministry for Housing, the Housing Commission of Victoria, was the fact that urban areas which weren't really slums, they were dilapidated perhaps, but they weren't slums.
So the fight is to preserve heritage, and rather than housing, because the housing was to be what people actually wanted, was not to live in a tower block. They didn't want those. And so the opposition to tower blocks was twofold. It was against the unnecessary destruction of a huge part of the heritage of the city, which would, of course, today is some of the most valuable land in the state.
One of the decisive community battles against the Housing Commission's urban renewal program was over the Brooks Crescent area in Fitzroy North. The Battle of Brooks Crescent was a pivotal campaign run by the Fitzroy Residents Association, and people involved included future Victorian Housing Minister Barry Pullen and Brian and Renata Howe.
A pretty popular kind of movement that basically said some clearance is unnecessary at that time, because of course what's occurring is the inner suburbs becoming very popular again. So with people moving in, buying up and renovating houses at the same time as similar houses are being demolished.
It tapped into, I think, growing concern about what the Housing Commission was doing and the demolition of so much of the city. So I think it tapped into what was people were suddenly thinking, good heavens, what's going on here, you know?
The Brooks Crescent battle was won by residents, and it was extremely consequential in ending the urban renewal program by the Housing Commission. When Rupert Hamer became the Victorian Premier in 1972, he formally put an end to the Housing Commission's inner suburban demolition and high-rise projects. While the Housing Commission had perhaps gone too far in its demolition program, its construction of public housing across inner Melbourne provided safe, secure and affordable housing to many low-income people.
The establishment of the Housing Commission, was obviously important because you needed to have a statutory authority that could, really get on with the work of both the slum clearance but also construction as well. The towers played a really important role over that journey, particularly with successive waves of migrant communities who came to this country, started off their lives in the towers, got themselves established and then moved on. We should celebrate that actually, because we know that safe, affordable and secure housing is fundamental to people's welfare.
They certainly provided accommodation in the inner cities close by their places of employment still, which I think was one of the great benefits, was that people who lived in Collingwood still could go and work in the shoe factories and the leather factories and all the other small industries that characterised much of Collingwood and Fitzroy, etc. So initially, I think they were seen as an appropriate solution to the slum, the housing problem in Melbourne, which was quite acute. People living in depressed, insanitary and substandard housing in very rundown areas were living in clean, well-ventilated apartments. It's just that they were austere, almost Spartan, because of regulations that the ministry imposed on their new tenants.
There are many questions regarding the appropriateness of Victoria's public housing, as it grapples with an array of issues reminiscent of the challenges faced in slum living conditions. These include overcrowding, vermin, mould growth, unemployment, drug-related concerns, maintenance defects, and poor amenities, prompting assertions that Victoria's public housing towers bear resemblance to high-rise slums.
The vast majority of people who are living in the towers worked, but they don't work anymore. I mean, basically, people living in, so it's become really residualised, what people call residualised housing now. So people living in the towers, in public housing more generally, not just the towers, are on statutory benefits. The vast majority are on statutory benefits.
I mean, the purpose of public housing is to take people out of poverty, not to concentrate poverty. And in a sense, because the means test is so tight to get into public housing, people desperately want to stay there because, in a sense, they're protected, but they're not encouraged to, in a sense, make progress, to get work and become part of the community. And in fact, it's hard for them because there's an isolation effect. The Housing Commission is very patronising and paternalistic. It's the opposite of what Barnett thought. He thought the Housing Commission could set the standard for decent housing, not become something that was manufactured housing, but completely insensitive.
The state government has now committed to rebuild all the towers by 2051, with 2 derelict and vacant towers in Carlton the first to be knocked down and rebuilt by 2028.
Our 44 high-rise towers are old, they are out of date, they are crumbling, they need to go.
The state government's recently unveiled housing statement marks a significant shift in housing policy, reminiscent of the ambitious slum reclamation efforts from the 1950s and 60s. If executed judiciously, this initiative holds immense promise in enhancing the quality of public housing and fostering a diversified use of these valuable residential estates. Nevertheless, it is imperative that the lessons from the past be heeded, particularly from the slum reclamation era, where planning decisions were wrested away from local communities and harsh, abrupt and life-altering policies were imposed in a paternalistic manner on people's lives. We must strike a delicate balance between progress and community empowerment, ensuring that our housing policies serve the greater good without compromising the voices and needs of people they affect.